The one-touch system looks like all of the other modules that I've created. Obviously, I need to change this to 2015. I see these things as I'm talking. It's got no required scripts, or that is modules here. It doesn't use any modules. It's got one local variable, which is layers, which we'll set up in the init function, and a few localizations, which I probably didn't even use, but I just put them in here because they're so common. And then we get into the definition. The definition is basically the init function and the cleanup function. Our init function does what? It takes the layer that we passed in, the layers reference, and it stores it in our local layers variable. I have the option to pass in some parameters if I wanted to. I always make my functions with an additional parameters option. Didn't need it this time, so I didn't use it. In the final product, I will probably remove this. For now, I'll leave it alone. Prints out a message. Now, what I like to do, a lot of people also do this. They like to use, in fact, Charles, and I was looking at a bit of Charles's code a couple weeks ago, and Charles was doing this, and this sounds negative, so I'm not trying to be negative here, but people will use the runtime touch event listener to take inputs. Now, I don't like the runtime touch listener. It's great for certain things, but most of the time it causes more trouble than it helps with. Again, like I said with player, I like to set up my listeners so that I don't have to clean them up. People in the forums know this. Some people think I'm lazy. It's all good. I'm lazy with regard. I like things to work as magically and as simply as possible. And in this case, what I always do for my inputs, if I can, is I will create, for simple games with 1 and 2 touch inputs, I will create one or more objects which span the screen. They take up the entire screen space, so if I touch anywhere, the input is going to occur. And I create an actual object which I then attach a listener to, so that when the object is removed, the listener goes away. Again, I don't have to clean it up. So for this example, I'm going to change a bit of the code just to show you what's going on. Okay, so what have we done here? In the first line, I created a rectangle using an image out of the images folder. And just for people who are curious about this, let me go back. One thing that all of my apps and games include, in the images folder I have a file called fillT and another one called fillW. FillW is a 16 by 16, very tiny, all white image, which I can then use to create any size rectangle I want and fill it with all white, which is what I'm doing here. And then later, if I wanted to hide that but still keep it touchable, I could simply replace that with fillT as an all transparent 16 by 16 rectangle. Now, the key here is a lot of people would get as far as, they say, making a rectangle with no image, which is I'm sorry, I'm undoing things here as I go. They would make a rectangle and then they would say, I'll just make the alpha 0, or I'll set is visible to false. Well, in Corona, if it's not visible or if the alpha is set to 0, then the rectangle becomes untouchable unless we set another flag, which is hit masked or is hit testable. I can't remember. Regardless, I've made the mistake enough times that I simply say, you know, the effect I'm going for here is I don't want to see it. So I'll simply replace the rectangle fill with a transparent image. Now, Corona doesn't know that the image is transparent, so it will assume that it is still touchable. I'm not sure if this makes sense. If you purposely set the alpha of an object to 0, or if you set the isVisible flag to false, what you're telling Corona is make that untouchable. Unless I said, no, I still want it touchable. So it's like you have to bend over backwards. Whereas all you're trying to do is hide it. So let me show you what happens here. I've created this. I'm using a white rectangle. I set the alpha to 20%, and now when I run this, you'll see, oh, and I put it in the overlay layer, so that's on top of everything else, because I wanted to see what's going on. This is to allow me to debug my code. So now we can see that the rectangle is from edge to edge across the screen. Everything turns sort of more white, which means that it's there, it's present. Now we add the touch listener, and on the begin phase, I'm going to set the color to green, and on the end phase, I'm going to set it back to white. By default, all rectangles the fill is white. So now this is already activated. When I touch the screen, it turns green. I know it's working. When I release, it turns white. Perfect. Okay, so we know that our touch listener is working. What's left? The magical connection part. So you'll recall that I said I like to keep my modules separated. So what I'm doing here is in the began phase. I could have done this in the ended phase, but I want to steer. I want to start steering the very moment the user touches the screen so that it is as immediate as possible for them. I don't want them to have to touch and release. I want it to steer immediately. Touch, steer. Release, touch, steer. So people, if you put it on the ended phase, people will complain and they'll say it feels kind of laggy, or it feels kind of, it's not responding quickly enough. And in here, I'm using the function which I talked about in the first or second show, which is basically, it's the runtime dispatch event, but written in such a way, it's changed a little bit so that it's very straightforward. What this code does is it injects into the system a event called onOneTouch. And then I pass along no parameters. I'm not adding any other information. So as soon as this executes, any other bits of code out here that are listening for that event will catch it and do something with it. This doesn't need to know about those objects, and those objects don't need to know about this. They're completely disconnected. So let's go ahead and let's leave the debug bit on, and let's go back to the player code to make it listen for this. So we look back in the init code, and if we scroll down a little bit, you'll see a bit here that says add a one-touch listener. Let me make that active. So following my normal methodology, I say player, and then I give it the name of the event. I could have made this event anything I wanted, but I called it onOneTouch. I could have called it onOneTouch is awesome. And then over here, I would simply name this and this onOneTouch is awesome. So the function name matches the event that I am trying to listen for. Now I'm going to put it back to onOneTouch because that is my normal naming nomenclature. So we're listening for onOneTouch. I'm creating a function called onOneTouch. It takes a self parameter, an event parameter, and then it does something. First thing it does, it's going to print out a message to give me some debug response that says, hey, I got the message. So I can look in the console and say, it's working. So even if everything after this line doesn't work, I mess up my physics code, I goof up, at least I know the event got this far. Then it says, is the game running? Has the isRunning flag been set to true? If it's not true, don't do anything. That player's probably not there anymore. The game's over. You hit a wall. Something occurred, either hasn't started or it's over. Now, assuming we get past that point, you'll remember that we said self current direction, and I set it to something. Initially, it was left. So all this code does is it says what direction is our current direction, change that to the other direction. It's just a flag that I'm using to keep track of what direction I want to move in, and then set the linear velocity. So if I moved left last time, I want to move to the right, which is positive x minus y. If I moved to the right last time, I want to move to the left, which is negative x, negative y. So it's always negative y, and it's just the x bit that's going to change. Then the final step here is use my special function, which is the shorthand notation for runtime. This is the same as saying runtime add event listener. It's just shorter. So I say listen for the named event. Make sure that it matches what I called it over here on one touch. Yes, it does. And because the player has a function assigned to that a field with the same name, all I got to do is pass in player. And that is it. Again, player code doesn't know about the touch input objects. The objects over there know nothing about the player. If I wanted to create other things in my game that were listening for this event, I could. None of them need to know about each other. And as soon as we run this code, I can hit the screen and it changes directions. Let me do that again. I'm going to hit it. Change, 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 change. Hits the wall. Game over. So let's do the camera code because that helps sort of roll things out. And then if we feel like it, if we have time, we can do the particle code or we can save that for next week.
This is looking good. I like this.
So yeah, like I said last week, the wall code was the hardest to implement and figure out. All of this stuff is really super straightforward. All you're doing, giving this thing a body to hit things and stop, setting the linear velocity to move to the left or move to the right, and then listening for an event. Very, very straightforward.